Hello learners and listeners, welcome to this session. Today's topic is part of the course BGP 003 Conflict and Peace Management. Myself Dr. G. Uma, faculty in the School of Gender and Development Studies, Indira Gandhi National Open University, New Delhi. Before we get into this topic, just I would like to introduce this topic. I have prepared this topic in a two-part. Today we will see the part 1, the next session we will see the part 2. You all know United Nations is the instrument organization to start the peacekeeping mission at the international level. The United Nations Peacekeeping Mission is a unique arrangement designed to maintain peace in the world. When peacekeeping operations were initially introduced, no one could visualize their relevance and popularity the way we see it today. Till date, almost every part of the globe has seen one or the other form of peacekeeping mission launched there. Peacekeeping missions have become the mainstay of international relations and conflict resolution around the world. You know that it is extremely important to learn about this unique arrangement. So, we need to know what is peacekeeping mission, why the international agency like United Nations has introduced the peacekeeping mission. So, everything we will, how this peacekeeping mission really helpful for conflict resolution. We discuss everything in this session. It was introduced as a response to a special situation in 1956, and ever since it has come to be seen as an answer to many situations of interstate and intrastate conflicts. Peacekeeping missions have grown in number, stature, functions and scale. They are no longer limited to deployment in situations of interstate conflicts alone. They are performing newer functions and rendering civil administration tasks in situations of internal conflict and post-Civil War reconstruction. By looking at this introduction, dear learners, you will come to know peacekeeping missions not only deployed in the interstate conflicts alone. UN International Agency will deploy the peacekeeping mission to perform newer functions like rendering civil administration tasks in situations of internal conflict and post-Civil War reconstruction. With this background and introduction, let us see the objective of this session. I have prepared this session with the following objectives. First objective is to know the importance of peacekeeping as an approach to maintaining international peace. The second one is the unique circumstances in which the peacekeeping missions evolved, the nature and features of this agreement, the changes introduced in peacekeeping missions over the years and the critical appraisal of the arrangement and its relevance for the maintenance of international peace and security. These are the 5 objectives. These 5 objectives will be dealt in this lecture and the next lecture. Let us start with the evolution of peacekeeping mechanism. Peacekeeping missions, mechanisms and peacekeeping mission as an answer to conflicts was not envisaged by the founding fathers of the United Nations. That is why there is no reference to peacekeeping mission in the UN Charter nor any provisions related to it. It was devised a decade after the establishment of the United Nations. Therefore, peacekeeping mission is known as the extra charter of development in the United Nations system. They were never planned or strategically designed, rather they have emerged in response to temporary but urgent needs. So, peacekeeping mission emerged when the United Nations was founded in 1945, the world leaders and the founding fathers, and they never envisaged that they have to establish the peacekeeping mission. After looking at the urgency of developing peacekeeping mission to address the various inter-conflict between states as well as some intra-conflict within the state to bring peace and some civility. The UN has established the Peacekeeping Mission. So, therefore, Peacekeeping Mission is known as the extra charter development in the UN system. They were never planned or strategically designed, rather they have emerged in response to temporary but urgent needs. Let us briefly look at the context in which peacekeeping plan initially emerged. In 1956, a crisis appeared to be building up in Egypt known as Suez Crisis. You all must be know Suez Canal. The United Kingdom and France, the two permanent members of the Security Council, have invaded Egypt to gain control over Suez Canal, which was nationalized by the President of Egypt. Following the invasion, the military situation in the Suez region got worsened. In the UN system, all matters relating to maintenance of international peace and security are primarily the concern of the Security Council. Hence, the Suez Crisis too came up for discussions in the Security Council. However, the Security Council was unable to take any decision to defuse the crisis due to the deadlock caused by the veto cast by the United Kingdom and France. Because they are Security Council permanent members, they have a veto power. The deadlock in the Security Council gave rise to a situation wherein the matter had to be referred to the General Assembly. The General Assembly discussed the matter and requested the Security Council, Dag Hammarskjöld, to submit a plan to defuse the situation in Suez region. In response to this request, the Secretary General, that is Dag Hammarskjöld, submitted a plan for the deployment of peacekeeping forces on 6th November 1956. The plan was mainly drafted by the President of the General Assembly, Lester B. Pearson, a Canadian national. This plan was unique in a sense that it involved deployment of forces, but it was intended to be less offensive in nature as compared to the enforcement measures taken by the United Nations under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter. Ever since 1956, Peacekeeping Mission has been found to be very useful in dealing with escalation of tension or violence in the situations of conflict. Peacekeeping has emerged as an additional procedure to oversee the maintenance of international peace and security in the event of failure of peaceful settlement of disputes or deadlock due to veto in the Security Council. We have learnt the background of the peacekeeping mission, how the peacekeeping mission in the United Nations has emerged. Now let us look at the features of peacekeeping. The objective of peacekeeping operations, as the term suggests, is to maintain peace, keep order and act as a buffer between the two conflicting groups. The aim is not to defeat an aggressor or restore peace that has been breached. The peacekeeping forces are not deployed to remedy a situation. They are deployed to prevent further escalation of tension or conflict. The objective is to maintain peace while keeping the conflict at manageable levels without deciding about the nature of conflict or who is the aggressor. Secondly, peacekeeping forces were deployed as buffer forces between the conflict parties. They merely separated the hostile armies by stationing or positioning themselves in the middle. In terms of the use of force, peacekeeping forces resembled police force more than a military forces because they were not heavily armed. Peacekeeping forces were mandated to use force as a last resort in self-defense. Therefore, the measures used were short of armed force. Thirdly, peacekeeping forces were expected to maintain an attitude of neutrality and impartiality towards the conflict parties. It means that peacekeeping forces did not favor or take sides with either of the parties of the conflict. In principle, peacekeeping forces were not concerned with the cause of conflict who was at fault. Their mandate was merely to diffuse the situation by acting as a buffer forces, by keeping the fighting parties away from each other. Therefore, peacekeeping forces did not take sides in deciding the merits of claims made by the parties to the conflict. The peacekeeping forces did not enforce a political settlement but only assisted the parties in suspending violence and buying time for a negotiated settlement. The peacekeepers must not interfere in the internal matters of the state. Fourthly, the most importantly, peacekeeping forces were deployed only with the consent of the state's party to the conflict. Consent was imperative because it indicated a desire on the part of the disputants to avoid a full-scale conflict. Consent has been considered as an inevitable to the success of the peacekeeping operations. Dear learners, now you must be aware about the features of peacekeeping forces in the United Nations. The first one is that peacekeeping is not to defeat an aggressor or restore peace that has been breached. So, the aim is to not to deploy to remedy the situation, that you need to understand. They have deployed to prevent further escalation or tension in the conflict. Okay. So, the main objective of the peacekeeping forces is to maintain certain level of or manageable level of peace without deciding about the nature of conflict and who is the aggressor. This is you all must understand. The second one is that it's like for deployed as a buffer forces between the conflicting parties. So, peacekeeping forces, they don't side with any conflicting parties. Okay, they are act as a buffer. So, they try to maintain a peace and they prevent further escalation of conflict. That is very important. And the peacekeeping forces, they have given a mandate to use the force as a last resort in self-defense. Therefore, the measures used were short of armed force. And next one is that peacekeeping force was expected to maintain an attitude of neutrality and impartiality towards the conflict parties. It means that peacekeeping forces did not favor or take sides with either of the parties of the conflict. In principle, peacekeeping forces were not concerned with the cause of conflict and who is the fault. That is not their concern. Their mandate was to merely diffuse the situation by acting as a buffer forces, by keeping the fighting parties away from each other. Okay. So, they don't take any sides. They are not part of the either side of the conflicting parties, and peacekeeping forces, they don't force any political settlement, but only assist the parties in suspending violence and buying time for negotiated settlement. So, and the peacekeeping forces, they don't interfere in internal matters of any conflicting parties. And consent is the last one. Consent is the very important. Again and again I am saying that consent was very imperative because it indicated a desire on the part of the disputants to avoid a full scale conflict. Consent has been considered as inevitable to the success of the peacekeeping operation. Also, member of the states of United Nations cannot force the parties to do a dispute to accept the presence of peacekeeping force. It is a force meant to prevent escalation of tensions and thus cannot be imposed. The parties to the dispute have to willingly accept the peace initiatives by the United Nations. That is very important. If any region in the world, if there is a conflict zone, the parties to the dispute have to willingly accept the peace initiative by the United Nations. The consent is required not only for the establishment but also for the way in which a peacekeeping operation will carry out its mandate. The conflicting parties are consulted about the countries that will contribute the troops for the peacekeeping mission. That is another important. So, the conflicting parties are consulted about the countries that will contribute the troops for peacekeeping mission. Fifthly, the Secretary General has the right to decide about the composition of the troops. However, the troops are contributed by the member states voluntarily. With this element of voluntary participation comes the principle of collective responsibility. Though the military personnel are provided by member states on voluntary basis, they are collectively responsible to the Secretary General once they enter the peacekeeping arrangement. The initial plan for peacekeeping mission, it was agreed that the forces will not include troops from the 5 permanent members of the United Nations. This was done to avoid the problems associated with big power politics and ideological groups in international relations. Non-involvement of major powers also distinguishes the peacekeeping mission from the enforcement action. Though there are exceptions, medium and small powers like Canada, India and Nordic countries have usually contributed troops for peacekeeping missions. This has been done to insulate major powers from peacekeeping arrangement as also to refuse any changes of interventions or big power interest. Moreover, it was held that medium states best represent the image of neutrality. Peacekeeping missions can be drawn into 2 categories. Okay, that you have to understand. So far we talked about the how the peacekeeping missions has emerged at the international level and what are the basic objectives of the peacekeeping mission to deployed in particular conflict zones. And these peacekeeping missions can be drawn into 2 categories. The first are the observer operations, which contain small groups of observers to oversee the maintenance of the status quo. These were more popular in the initial years of the establishment of the United Nations. The second category of peacekeeping missions is the operations involving use of armed forces unit. Initially, they were very few in number, only about 5 peacekeeping operations involving deployment of forces till 1970, but their number has multiplied phenomenally in recent decades, particularly since 1990. Then I will explain or I will talk about few important peacekeeping missions. In the initial years of the United Nations, the observers were sent to various parts of the world where conflicts and disagreements were witnessed. These were usually small groups of personnel and were extremely popular in the later part of the 1940s. Some prominent examples of observer missions are UN Truce Supervision Organization, that is UNTSO in Palestine in 1948, UN MOGIP between India and Pakistan since 1949, UN OGIL in Lebanon, UN YOM in Yemen, UN GOMAP between Afghanistan and Pakistan, and so on and so forth. The observers of the ceasefire were provided by the national governments and were paid by the respective governments. As a result, the field observers received orders from their governments even while working for the United Nations. This you need to understand. The observers of the ceasefire were provided by the national governments and were paid by their respective governments. So, thus the field observers received orders from their governments even while working for the United Nations. This greatly dented their neutrality and impartiality. The internationalization of observer forces and their supervision and control by the United Nations became possible with the Secretariat's control over the observer salaries, travel allowances and other expenses related to that. Thus, the identity of the observers shifted from being representatives of governments to individual experts directly under the charge of the United Nations. The fundamental principle of independence of observers has become the basis of impartiality, neutrality and independence of peacekeeping forces. The peacekeeping operations were deployed sparingly till 1970s. The first peacekeeping operations involving deployment of armed forces unit was the UN Emergency Force in 1956 to resolve the Suez Crisis. The UN Emergency Force was placed along with the Suez Canal on Egyptian territory. The second peacekeeping mission was sent to Congo in the form of the UN operations in Congo in 1960 when a conflict erupted between the rebels or secessionists in Congo and the Belgium paratroopers immediately after achieving independence from Belgium. It is claimed that Congo was the first instance where peacekeeping mission sacrificed the principle of using force only in self-defense. UNOC increasingly assumed enforcement-like powers and peacekeepers were openly taking sides, fighting for the central government of Congo. The UN Secretary General Dag Hammarskjöld died in a plane crash in 1961 while on inspection visit to Congo. Within a couple of years, another peacekeeping mission, that is UN Peacekeeping Force in Cyprus, was deployed in 1964 following communal clashes reported between the majority of the Greek Cypriots and minority Turkish Cypriots. In 1974, the UNFICYP separated the fighting Greek and Turkish forces. The efforts towards reunification of the two parts of the Cyprus have not come about. This remains one of the long-drawn deployments of the peacekeeping mission. The 1973 war between Israel and Egypt and Israel and Syria in the Sinai region and in Golan Heights resulted in redeployment of UNEF-2 to the Suez Canal region. In 1974, Israel and Syria reached an agreement to disengage in the Golan region. Ever since, the region was being maintained by UN Disengagement Observer Force to repel any possible incursions by either Israel or Syrian troops. In 1978, the Security Council established UN Interim Force in Lebanon to ensure the withdrawal of invading Israeli forces in southern Lebanon. Although this force was named as an interim force, it continued to be stationed there for over 30 years amidst another Israeli invasion in 1962. Much of the work of UNIFIL has been limited to providing humanitarian assistance, mine clearance and so on. So these are the important things about the peacekeeping missions. I have introduced the emergence of peacekeeping mission and importance of peacekeeping mission as an approach to maintaining international peace and unique circumstances in which the peacekeeping mission is evolved. And we have also discussed in this session the nature and the feature of this arrangement. The rest of the two objectives we will discuss in our next session. Thank you so much for listening, and we will again meet in some other session. Thank you.